All right, good afternoon. As promised, we're delighted to be joined by Connie Wagner-Raja, the Assistant Secretary General and Associate Administrator of UNDP and head of the Asia Pacific Division at UNDP. And sitting with her is Abdullah Al-Dardari, UNDP's resident representative in Afghanistan. So, Connie, please, you have the floor, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Steph, and thank you on this gloomy, rainy day that you're here with us. In fact, it was almost to the day a year ago that Abdullah was on screen in Kabul, and I was here, and we did a press briefing right here and announced some of the projections that we were looking at into 2022 that showed both the macroeconomic collapse, but also the near universal poverty numbers that we were projecting, with the hope that neither would come about. But as you can see with the report we just put out 1 year after, both these are sadly very much a reality. So we are looking at data on the Afghan economy that is showing a significant drop of the overall GDP, but also that we've got now 95 to 97% of Afghans who live below the poverty line. Now, based on this, and a year back, we very much felt, and very strongly as UNDP, that the only way to really handle this and address it is to get local economies kick-started across the country. And each kind of localized economy has its own kind of supply chains, its own supply and demand, particular products that are specific, but most importantly, run very vigorously by the informal sector. And an informal sector in Afghanistan that for years, for decades, has been run by women. So really focusing in on women-led businesses, both formal and informal, but also looking at how do you sustain incomes and how do you get jobs kick-started. And here is where in a year, making sure that over 500,000 Afghans have access to a temporary income has really been a significant part of doing what we can in this period. And Abdullah will speak a little more to this. So maybe just a few facts. One is that it is very clear that between the UN and a number of NGOs, both international and national, that going into last winter, we did collectively manage to avoid a massive catastrophe. That is undeniable. So it was absolutely essential to have that injection, very intense injection of humanitarian aid coming in very quickly ahead of the winter. Now, what we can't do is say, well, there's another winter coming, then there's another winter coming, and so on. So how does one move from that to really looking at development investments, directly with communities, directly injected into local economies that then really jumpstart this in a different way? Because with what was already a very small economy, if you think about pre-Taliban, it still was about a $20 billion economy. That then in a year, though, lost about $5 billion. That, if you just think about that, as the report shows you, that's about 10 years' worth of accumulated assets and wealth that just got lost in 10 months. That kind of dramatic collapse we've not seen anywhere in the world. And if the majority of Afghans are now spending 60, 70, some of them even 80% of their income, their household income on food and fuel, then you've got a situation where they're not being able to recover and rebound even a year later. So for us, even though the report was quite damning on the number of jobs lost, if you look at that number and look at 700,000 jobs lost, and the majority of those women in the education sector, and happy to also go into that. But when I was in Afghanistan, one of the things that I was bringing up constantly was that this is $1 billion loss to the economy. And this is not a loss that this economy can bear. Maybe my last point is that the cash infusion that the UN has brought into the country in this past year has been absolutely essential. It has helped with local economic activity. It has helped to stabilize the currency, and all of this done, again, working directly with people, but with some of the national institutions like the central bank, being the technical people in the central bank, being fundamental to make sure that the Afghani doesn't collapse completely, which is hugely important. So let me, on that note, Steph, if you don't mind, hand over to Abdullah to talk about some of the ground reality that Abdullah is based in Kabul, is here on a brief visit, some of that ground reality, but also projecting forward.
Thank you. On the evening of the 15th of August, after the Taliban knocked on the door of our compound on Jalalabad Road in Kabul, we made a very clear decision. We are staying, we will deliver, and we will deliver in a different way. We have to focus on communities and we have to work directly with those communities. That's one. Second, we were and still believe that humanitarian assistance alone will not make it. Afghanistan's humanitarian load, if I may use the term, has increased from 19 million people to 22 million people in just 14 months. So that it cannot be dealt with by just providing humanitarian assistance, despite the very importance of that humanitarian assistance. And therefore, livelihoods, creating jobs, and even trying to recover local economies has been crucial. So we've been working with local communities through cash for work, microfinance, technical assistance, local infrastructure development, and so on. We have successfully created 560,000 temporary jobs. We have reached and supported through finance and technical assistance and training 34,000 women entrepreneurs. And we are targeting this year to reach 50,000 women entrepreneurs in our support. For the next 3 years, we are determined to try to create 2 million full-time jobs that will require much higher levels of financial aid, and that requires much more efficient economic models than what we used to have. Because let me just stress that our assessment that Afghanistan will only achieve 26% of the SDGs by 2030 if things continue as they are today. However, even if the country receives $70 billion of aid from now till 2030, it will only achieve 46%. The economic model is narrow, it's non-competitive and non-inclusive. It did not create jobs, it did not reduce poverty, even at times of GDP growth. This is our focus, the bottom-up approach, the trickle-up economics that we are putting forward. So we want to create 2 million jobs through revival of private sector, through working with local communities, through focusing on women entrepreneurs, through reviving local infrastructure for agricultural productivity, and reviving microfinance institutions and the banking sector. Now, this may seem to be a very tall order, but we believe that without these 2 million jobs, the humanitarian load will not be reduced. And in fact, we need to know that we have to spend the next 3 years working jointly between development, or what we call basic human needs activities, and humanitarian activities hand in hand, in order to start making a dent in the humanitarian situation in the country. So we stabilize first, start recovery immediately. That's the focus for the next 3 years. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. James?
James Bays from Al Jazeera. I appreciate what you just said about the bottom-up approach, but I'd actually like to ask you about the funds of money that are sitting there, particularly the 3.5 billion that's in now this trust fund based in Geneva. What is going on with that money? Who is liaising with? I mean, I don't really know how this mechanism works, the trust fund, whoever the trust, I don't even know who's administering it, but how is that working? Who in the UN is talking to that trust fund? How and for what will that money be released? And how much better would it make the situation if the other 3.5 billion, which is owned by Afghans but has been given to 9/11 victims, even some of them are saying that's wrong, was also released back to Afghanistan?
Thanks, James. So let me say that I was in Washington last week, asked the same questions that you did. I think other than the actual movement of the 3.5 billion to this trust fund in Geneva, what it is exactly going to be used for, how it will be used for, has not been worked out yet. They're looking at setting up a board with multiple partners and stakeholders to look at that decision. The only
Sorry,
This is the US administration. The
they have
days-
sole control of this money, do they?
the U.S. administration is discussing this, and the State Department is discussing how this would be, but with multiple stakeholders on this board who would then look at the use of this fund. There was not a discussion on the other half of the monies, but certainly on the 3.5 billion, I think the understanding is how can it get into the country to stabilize the macroeconomy and to look at private sector engagement and to look at some of the essential services, including electricity in the country. But I don't, they were very clear that they've not made any further decisions, and that's the information we have so far.
Quick follow-up, it's been more than a year. Are you saying to them, why are you taking so long, given how desperate, in your briefing, the situation is in Afghanistan?
I think this is part of a larger negotiation with the Taliban on the rights of women and girls, for example, and the ability for girls to get back to secondary school, for all women to work. It's part of that larger discussion, a more inclusive government. So it's not that anyone's been sitting not saying anything for a year. I think it's part of this overall discussion going on and the negotiation with the Taliban. But from what we know, this is where it's at right now.
Miriam?
Thank you so much for doing this briefing today. My question is also about the fund that is going for assistance in Afghanistan. The central bank, which is under control of the Taliban, has always welcomed the cash assistance to Afghanistan. This is while UN repeatedly says that this money goes straightly to people of Afghanistan, and the Taliban do not have or do not touch this money. At the same time, and also they say that money goes to a private bank. But at the same time, to maintain the stability of Afghan currency, the Taliban occasionally injects several $1 million into the market so they can just keep the market stable. Where does the central bank, which is under control of Taliban, get this money, the US dollars, to just keep the markets stable? And I also have another question, but you can answer this one first if you don't mind.
So,
Thank you.
to be very clear, there is no money going through the central bank or to the central bank or managed by the central bank. The UN money arrives in Kabul and then goes to the vault of the Afghanistan International Bank, a private bank, and then each agency uses its own share of that money in its programs and operations and requirements. So every time a batch of money arrives in Kabul, the central bank issues that statement. Maybe you've seen the statement. Doesn't say that the money is coming to the central bank, says the money is coming to Afghanistan. And that's correct. Then the money goes to different commercial banks. For each agency has its own banking channels. That amount of money in the overall macroeconomy, of course, helps stabilize the currency. Naturally, when you have more than $1 billion already coming to the country, the exchange rate market will be stabilized, and that explains partially why the Afghani as currency has been stabilized since the beginning of this operation, with the UN money coming in cash. So those two operations are separate. I need to stress what the central bank does in the exchange market of Kabul and other cities is separate completely from the UN operations bringing cash into Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for that. My second question, in your report, it does mention the women being completely removed from the offices, the government, from work offices. And as I had an interview with Rina Amiri, the special envoy for Afghan women and girls, the talks are not going very well. The Taliban are staying firm that they are not allowing girls into schools and not allowing women to go back to work. If this never comes to an end and the U.S. and the West doesn't reach an agreement with the Taliban, what is going to happen to those women who are the breadwinners of the families and the economy of Afghanistan overall?
Please.
Let me start with a reflection on that, and thank you for that question, and then if I can ask Abdullah to come in. So, you know, when we say Afghanistan, as you well know, Miriam, this is not one monolith of a country. And we're certainly finding now being spread in all parts, in all regions of Afghanistan, that the decrees are being interpreted differently in different parts of the country. So in some parts of the country, you do see that secondary schools remain open. In other parts, they have closed. You do see in some parts that tertiary education for women is open, and in other parts, the tertiary institutions are closed. So it is a mixed picture. The same goes for women entrepreneurs who own and run their businesses. I would say by now, if the 34,000 women entrepreneurs that we're working with were not able to head to work and keep their small businesses, micro and small businesses going, you would have seen a much more devastating collapse of this country. So what maybe the world is not seeing yet is that this country is being held together by a lot of women actually coming to work and keeping their businesses going. The unfortunate thing, and the report points to this, is in the formal sector, and particularly in the education sector, we've seen so many women, teachers particularly, and educators in general, not being able to come back to work. A small proportion being moved into primary school, others being told to stay at home, and being still paid a fraction of their original salaries. And some in the regions where secondary schools are open have been able to move. So it's a mixed picture. But as we've been saying repeatedly, there's both a massive human rights issue here of girls and women not being able to continue to learn and to work. And it's a huge loss to the economy. The country can't go on limping on one foot with half the population not being able to fully to learn and to work. That's for sure.
Just to say one word on this, Mariam. We are determined. In a sense, we will keep working with women entrepreneurs. We will keep working with women-led NGOs and civil society organizations. We will make sure that imagine if we make sure that the 2 million jobs, half of those 2 million jobs are for women. That's our determination. So we are in the business of pushing forward, keep pushing the envelope and engaging, because that requires engagement all the time. If there are obstacles here, we push, we engage, we maneuver. Most importantly, we want the money, the support, the access, and the freedom to operate in the market available for Afghan women.
Thank you. Maggie and then Abdelhamid.
Hi, I'm Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. My question to Abdullah is, what kind of reaction and cooperation are you getting from the de facto authorities in terms of this job program? I mean, it seems it should be their job to create jobs, not yours, but you seem to be doing their work for them. So are they being helpful, cooperative, especially with this part of the jobs that are for women? And what about Afghan men? What's their role in helping the women?
Again, just like what Kani said, it is not the same everywhere. So in most of the places we are operating now, when we operate across the country, so far we have not faced any serious objections to providing support to women. And I must add that the Afghan women have proven to be extremely resilient and brave and courageous, because they insisted on coming to the training meetings, on coming to the induction programs in order to provide with the money. Even we have all these programs on human rights and local community reconciliations. They show up completely fearless. So. But in some places, you see some pushback. Engagement helps reducing that pushback. Some places we succeed, some places we don't. So we find other ways. So now we are moving into digital training programs on the mobile phones. We have now almost 20,000 businesswomen who are receiving that training program on their mobile phones. So we have to continue pushing. Afghan men, the Afghan society in general, the local communities have been tremendous. In the most conservative places, if I may use the term, even in those places, we saw the communities very supportive of Afghan women taking their full role in the local economy.
Thank you. Abdelhamid and then Don. And then Deji.
Thank you so much. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic Daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Nice to see you, Abdullah, again.
Nice to see you.
After so many years. I have two questions. First, about women. Before the Taliban took over, the percentage of women who were going to school, I think it's about 18%. Correct me if that percentage is not accurate. So it wasn't a rosy picture, and the media tried to show that only after Taliban the women's rights had been completely stepped over. But my second question also about the promises Taliban gave when they took over, especially about protection of minorities, keeping terrorists out of the country, protection of the human rights, and inclusive government. How much they implemented of these promises, especially when it comes to the minority, the Hazara Afghans. So can you give me some information?
I'll say a few words on the first question.
Thank you.
Abdelhamid, great to see you. The economic model that prevailed before 15 August was not sustainable anyway. As I said, sometimes there were some strong GDP growth figures, but at the same time, unemployment was going up and poverty was going up. We need to remember that by 2020, when COVID hit, already unemployment was more than 54% and poverty levels were about 70%. Women have always, those figures have always been more negative towards women than they were to men. That's unfortunately the reality. So you are right, and in fact, even growth had been going down in the last 3 to 4 years before COVID-19. It was exacerbated by COVID-19 and then, of course, by the shock of 15 August. So our attempt is to, as I said, to try to see whether we can do a different model for economic recovery that includes women and includes youth especially, who have felt always excluded from the mainstream economic activity of the country.
Maybe on two of the other points, you're very right that the numbers of girls in school were very low to start with. But you could see them inching up, right? The rate of acceleration, painfully slow, but still headed in the right direction. But there were two other figures that were very important. The numbers of women in parliament were significant. And the numbers of women, I think it was in parliament was 1/4
Yes.
or was women in parliament. And in the public sector, 1/3 of women, civil servants. So these were two big, in 20 years you saw the numbers. There you saw the acceleration. So to see all of that just wiped out in months, those two, in civil service and in parliament, is devastating. On the girls' education, and this now links to your last point, you're very right that it was some of the key fundamental negotiation points or promises, as you call them, protection of minorities, an inclusive government, women's rights and girls' education. We're not there. We're not close. And that is why it's so essential to keep the foot on the pedal to make sure that these are continuous asks. And we've got to keep all the doors and windows open to have this conversation all the time, every day. And as certainly as a UN, that is something from the SG to the SRSG, the new SRSG going in to Kabul, and all of us. Is something we will continuously take up. It's a daily conversation.
Thank you. Dawn and then Deji.
Thank you for the briefing. I'm Dawn Clancy with Pass Blue. I just had a couple of follow-ups. When you say kickstarting the local economy, what does that look like? And then when you talk about temporary jobs, what's temporary? I think that's it. Oh, what kind? I think you said there were interpreter positions, but what? I may have misheard you. Definitely, it seems as though I did. But what kind of temporary jobs? If you could provide some detail.
Sure. The main source of temporary jobs are public works, what we call cash for work programs. For example, building or repairing irrigation canals, which is a very important activity in order to kickstart the local agricultural economies. Working on local roads, building some storage facilities for agricultural produce that are unfortunately going to loss because there is no storage facilities in Afghanistan. A massive solarization program of storage facilities and also, by the way, of health facilities and schools. So solar power is one of the most important, including solar power for municipal drinking water, pumping stations, and the works in order to avoid things like cholera or other diseases. So there has been a massive operation. A temporary job is something between 12 days of work up to 1 month of work. Now, 560,000 of those, meaning each household, that's 560,000 households who manage to have income that's sufficient for 1 or 2 months minimum. We know this is not enough, but this is the take-off phase from after 15 August. And that's why we are calling now to create 2 million permanent jobs with permanent revenue and incomes for those households. Only then we believe that the number of people who need humanitarian aid will start going down considerably.
Thank you. Desi, and then that'll have to be the last question.
Hi, this is Deju Xu with China Central Television. I have a couple of questions concerning your remarks as well as the report, because you just said, and in this report, your key message, the first one is Afghan economy lost nearly $5 billion in 12 months, which had taken almost 10 years to add. So what are the major reasons for such a big loss? Is that because of the Taliban take over the policy, or the chilling effects of international community, or the frozen assets abroad? What are the major reasons?
Okay. Afghan economy suffered what we call a dual shock, a shock in demand. When you have an interruption of 40% of GDP foreign aid, 70% of Afghanistan development